Today is June the 4th, 1967. We're assembled in Grandma and Grandpa Cryer's home in Beaumont, Texas, for the purpose of recording some of their life's history and things that have made their lives so happy and successful. Helen and Bonnie and Grandma and Grandpa and Chuck and I are here, and we turn the time now over to Grandma and Grandpa, and they can just ad-lib as they want to. The main thing is we want to get a history of these things, a permanent record, so that we can have them for posterity purposes. So, Grandpa, you start it off, and we'll see what we can come up with here.
Well, I guess any life history has to begin more or less with the starting point, which is the birth date of the one that the history is about. So that would be me, Grandpa Cryer. I was born March the 8th, 1901, at Old Dollardsville in Polk County, Texas. It wasn't a town, so we just have to call it the post office. It was just a settlement of people in and around a post office. And my grandfather Jones, run the post office for years and years there. My daddy and mother built a little log cabin, I believe it was, up on the north side of their home, in a portion of Grandpa Jones's land, and that's where I was born. I can remember Mother telling about how my daddy would go off and work at public works and then come back and farm a while, and how the chicken snakes would get up in the top of the house and threaten to fall out on her. So it's lucky that I was even born at all, I guess. So that's pretty well the beginning, and we lived there till I was about 3 years old. Then we moved over to an old town called Village Mills. We lived there a little while and then over to Warren, not staying anywhere too long at a time. From Warren, we went to Beaumont. This is kind of a rust-up job. No details much. But we lived at Beaumont, for about 3 years. 3 years it was, from the time I was about 8 until I was about 11. And that's where I began to go to school, at Beaumont School. A.D. Rawlingson was the superintendent of the school, and I enjoyed school very much, at least some parts of it. Some of it I was as dumb as could be, and others I was pretty good average. We lived there, as I said, about 1913, and then we moved to Everdale, Texas. But before we go to Everdale, Texas, just a little something that happened that almost scared the very life out of me, and I think that's the reason I never did grow too much. The store caught on fire there and burned down, and it was a horrible fire. I thought the world was coming to an end, and I was the next to burn up, maybe, so I was very scared. And another thing that happened there was Halley's Comet. We watched that thing every night. Finally, it seemed to just fall through the heavens and lit up the whole country, and that was another time I was very scared. But we moved to Everdale, and there we remained until the amount of schooling I got was finished, about the 10th grade. And there's where I met the woman that I'm still with. Fortunately, we have been able to get along very nicely in our marriage vows. We haven't crossed one another too much, therefore we haven't had too much to repent of. But I can remember some of the things during our courtship days. They were very comical. She was, not a timid girl, but she was just bordering on that a little bit, and I wasn't too much better. And I remember we used to go to the little old Union church house there at Everdale. What I mean by that, there was a number of people, number of different churches met there. And we had a Sunday, someone else a Sunday, and so on till the month was gone. But on our nights there, we'd go to church. On bright moonlight nights is when we had our trouble. We'd come from the church house, and it was a great, big old, short, stocky pine that gave a beautiful shadow along the side of the road. And we were not in too much of a hurry to get through that shadow somehow or another. Anyway, we enjoyed the trip through the shadow very much. I remember another time, she worked up at the store. We call it Masterson's store. She worked up there, and she'd work until after dark. And the great hero, suitor of hers, would go up and bring her home. And along that road was another group of trees. It made a very nice walk for a lovely couple. A couple loving like we were. And it was pretty cool at times, and I had my coat on. And I remember one night we was coming along there, and we both had both hands in one of my coat pockets. And we was walking along, chatting about the future, I imagine, like we usually did. And directly she says, "My goodness, there comes somebody." And she ripped my coat pocket right off. But nevertheless, we did have a lot of fun. And the kids wanted to know about that for their grandchildren so that they would know that their grandparents were human. I think that's the reason, really the reason. But I'm afraid that they're going to be taught that we're more or less inhuman. But we enjoyed life very much, and in 1923 we were married. My wife lived right across the street in front of where I lived. And our courtship was no problem at all. I could sleep half the evening and then run over and see her on Sunday if I wanted to. And she didn't like it too much about me sleeping, but she tolerated it. But anyway, I worked hard during the week, and I'd take a nap in the afternoon and go see her later. I remember one time, I don't know whether she really wanted to make me jealous or not, but she had another boy on the string. He lived up the country, and he come down to see her one time. I had a date with her, and I should have gone on and kept that date and run that guy off, but he was bigger than me, and I didn't attempt it. So I just didn't go. I left him over there, and she didn't like that. I think her plan, if it was one, backfired on her, and it kind of made her sore because I didn't come over and defend my position. Anyway, I didn't, but after he was gone, I did come over and get what was coming to me, which wasn't very pleasant. But nevertheless, we went ahead and were married. We planned on having a June wedding. She had her heart set on being a June bride. She talked about it quite a lot, but you know, we were married in January. January the 6th. We just decided what's the use? What's the use to lose that much life? And so we were married at that date. And we already now had prepared our little home. We bought a little place, and we had our little furniture in it. It was humble, but it was adequate. We really enjoyed our little home, and we lived there for 6 months. My wife worked over at the store where she was working when I used to go get her. And I remember the poor girl forgot to put on her shoes one morning. and she was cooking my breakfast, and she reached up in the shelf to get a can of something or get something else, and she knocked off a can of tomatoes, and it hit right on one of her poor little old toes. And you know, that was in 1923, and this is 1967, and that toe still gives her trouble. So don't drop a can of tomatoes on your toe if you ever have a chance. And by the way, maybe you'd like to know who I married. This sweet girl that I married, who is now your grandmother, was Mrs. Lola. Miss Lola Dunn. She corrected me. She's sitting here beside of me. See that I don't say anything out of line. Miss Lola Dunn. No, she had never been married before, fortunately for me. And I changed her name, not against her will, but because I guess she was really sincere about it. And, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, possibly the world would have spun the other way and you children wouldn't have had us for grandparents if it hadn't happened. But I got discontented where I was working. My pay wasn't right, so I just quit and went to another place. Went over to Salisbury to go to work, which is...
What were you doing there?
Went over to Salisbury and went to work at the same type of work that I was doing at Everdale, which was oiling at the planer mill. What I mean by that, the planer mill had a lot of moving parts, and they required a lot of oil and grease. And that was my job. In fact, I was, you might call me a grease monkey. I got it all in the pores of my skin, and my clothes were greasy. But that's what I went to doing when I moved to Salisbury. And incidentally, we lived there 6 months, just like we did at Everdale. I don't know whether my whole life was going to be in 6 months spans or not. But anyway, there, to be frank with you folks, I actually got fired. I was fired for the first time in all my life. And not making any excuses. But how it happened, something happened to the big old fan that picks up the shavings. It creates a vacuum and picks up the shavings that comes off the lumber when it's being dressed and sends it out to someplace where it's burned. In this case, it went up to the mill to fire the boilers to make steam that run the engine, that planed the lumber that made the shavings, just like that continuous round. Somehow or another, this big old fan burned out its spurring or broke about and tore the thing all to pieces. They carried it down to the shop and rebuilt it and brought it and put it back. When they put it back, it was all out of balance. It went whoop, 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 only a whole lot faster up there. And I was oiling the whole mill, but it took all my time to keep those bearings from burning out. Had little bitty oil cups on them, so I decided I'd try to make some bigger ones and get them on. And I made a run for that, and while I was away fixing the big ones, it tore up again. The general manager came to the mill to see why it shut down. Somebody says it burnt a bearing. He says, who was responsible for it? He says, the oiler. What's his name? Cryer. Floyd Cryer. Says, fire him. Get rid of him. We don't want no such a man as that on the job at all. So they did fire me. Give me my time. And I went home. And come payday, I went down to get my pay. I met the manager, and he says, have you turned in your discharge slip yet? I said, no, sir, I still have it in my pocket. He said, well, don't turn it in. He says, I think we can put you back to work. Well, they did put me back to work, but I was unhappy about the condition, and I just quit and went on my way, admitting my defeat. Then we went to Weirgate, a town up in Newton County, about 60, 75 miles northwest of Salisbury, up in Newton County. And there we began our life in earnest. We lived there for 18 years. And there, both of our children were born and raised until the youngest one was 12 years old. And our first child was one of the greatest events, of course, that ever happened in our life. The other one was nonetheless, but it was the second happening of the same great event, which was, like I would say, after this broadcast is over, the next one will be just as eventful, but won't be as thrilling as this one. We lived in Weirgate on the extreme west side, what we call the sandbed. We refer to it yet when we lived down in the sandbed. Oh, it was dense sand. But we had our little garden. There we had our little girl. Then we got another job. I went there to doing the same thing I was doing at Salisbury, oiling the planing mill. I could do that, I guess, better than anything else. I was pretty slick. That's a figure of speech, but I kept my family eating on it for a while. Finally, a job came open as electrician there in the plant, electrician of the plant. And there I got my first experience, real experience, as an electrician. I had been studying this subject. I took a correspondence course from L.L. Cook while I was yet going to school. I finished it with pretty good grades, nothing to brag about, but about the average. And I was looking for a job. So this job was coming open, and a grand old friend of mine, Mr. Howard, Uncle Tom Howard, I was referred to, says, Mr. Cryer, why don't you apply for that job? I says, do you really reckon I could get it? He says, why not? Somebody's going to get it, and I know you won't get it if you don't ask for it. So I went and asked for the job, and I got it, to my surprise. And it was a great raise in my salary. I was making pretty good, a little above the average where I was oiling, but this almost doubled my income. So we were able to eat a little better anyway. And after I got this job, and I become a little more, influential. I had a better job, and I was moved up into a little better community, out of the sandbed, up into the former electrician's house. He moved out on the farm, and we took his place. And there, we carried our first baby, Mary Helen. I didn't say where she was born now. She was born down, as I say, in the sandbed, but we carried her there with us. And we carried her there with us. But there is where our second daughter was born, Annie Laura. We thought that was a very beautiful baby, and we thought that was a very beautiful name. Since, after she got big enough to be up and around, somebody nicknamed her Bonnie. And she's gone by that name Bonnie ever since. And we love the name, but her name was really Annie Laura. We lived in that house for a good while. Then the ice plant foreman died, and he had one of the nicest houses in town. And like asking for the job as an electrician, I had no idea that I could get that house. But from experience I had of asking for things that sounded impossible, I went and asked for that house. And just like the electrician's job, I got it. So we moved down there in a little better environment, and there we lived for some time. We were actually living there when the time come that we must leave Weirgate. I said that like we were going to have to leave, but we were not. We knew that the pine trees that we loved so well were being cut down. They were being cut down all over the place. All around us, those pine trees were being cut. And we knew that we couldn't just sit there and see them fall on our house almost, so to speak, and live in it. So I began to look for a job elsewhere. And it was just before the war broke, and they were putting on men in Beaumont, in the shipyard. They were looking for men. They were scouting for men. And because of that, I was able to get a job there. And there I worked for some 25 years. But let us go back to Whitgate for just a minute. When I was there working on this job as an electrician, some very interesting things happened. That was in our early days, was back before these steel or metal yard brooms came out. And we were using the old method of brush brooms, brooms made of brush. And this brush was a dogwood sprout. Dogwood is the name of a tree that grows up there. And while it is yet young, about 6 or 8 feet long, it has a bushy top. And they're fine boughs or limbs. And we'd go out and cut those and put them in bunches and tie them together tight, about 6 or 7 of them, and it would make a wonderful brush broom. Now, why I mentioned that was one of the reasons or the causes of our woods activities. We would go in the woods and gather those brush brooms, and at the same time, we maybe would have a little picnic in the woods, and we would really enjoy ourselves while we were out there. And then the little old girl, Helen, Mary Helen, our firstborn child, she was just able to walk good, but not long at a time. I'd carry the brush brooms on my shoulder. Now, we went about 3 miles for those brush brooms. That's quite a walk. 3 miles over and 3 back, maybe. Quite a walk for my wife and I and this little baby, just walking good. And I'd tote the brush brooms, and she'd toddle along. And she would look up at me and say, "Daddy, me papa." And I said, "Well, I'll tote you a little bit." I'd put her up on my shoulder and tote her on one shoulder with the brush brooms on the other until I'd get so tired. I'd put her down again, and she'd walk for a while longer, as long as she could, and then we would repeat the performance. And then when the other one came along, that was Anna Laura, we were still lovers of the woods. We'd go out walking and picnicking, and we finally were able to save up enough money to buy us an old car, and that added to our woods activities. We'd go out, and we could carry a little extra amount of luggage, such as food supplies and pots and pans, and we'd go out and cook our meals on the creek. I remember one day we were going through the colored quarters over to our campground, and a great big old rooster ran across the road. At least he started to run across the road, and it was so hot and so sandy that when he got right in the middle of the road, his old feet began to burn him, and he stopped and began to jump up and down right there, just squalling, and I run right square over him and killed him. And I was honest about it. I pulled over to the side and went back and got my big old rooster. Oh, he was a fine fella. And I asked a woman that was standing out in the road down there if she knew who he was. She said, "Yes, sir, he belongs to me." I said, "Well, he run in the road in front of me and I killed him. What I owe you?" She says, 50 cents. I pulled out 50 cents and gave her, which was a good price for a friar at that time. And she reached for a chicken. I said, "No, I bought the chicken. I'm going to take it with me." So I carried him on over on the creek, and we dressed him and cooked him over there, and enjoyed him. And that's pretty well the sum total of our experience in the woods. We could go into detail, but it'd only be more or less repetition. And then we moved to Beaumont. But before we left there, before we actually moved, it was necessary for the folks to stay there a while by themselves. Oh yes, there's one thing I wanted to tell you about before we left Weirgate completely, was some of the things that happened around there that was not too good. I told you about the pine trees. They were big fellows. They was what we called long-leaf yellow pine. And those pines just reached for the sky, and they just fought one another almost until they all become exhausted at about 150 feet high. That's quite a way up in the tops of the pines, and they stood too close to drive your car between. But one time we wanted to build a new water tower. So our superintendent went out and found an old second-hand one that he could get for a bargain. So they tore it down. It was a steel tower. They tore it down and moved it into Weirgate and piled it up along where they were going to build a tank. They cast the corner blocks for it to sit on, big concrete blocks. But they had no way to raise the steel into place. So this superintendent was an ingenious fellow when it come to getting the job done, but he was more or less merciless for the way he did it. So he went out in the woods. He wanted to find a straight tree about 125 feet long. So the way he did that now was to make a monkey out of me. I mean, a tree monkey. I clomb the tree. I carried up the line, a tape line, and I laid it down, and we measured it to where he thought it ought to cut off. And if it was long enough, okay, but we had to measure several. That meant I had to climb that 2-foot tree, about 125 feet high, 3 or 4 different ones of them. Finally, we found the one we wanted, and I clomb up it, cutting the limbs off, even with the trunk, as I went up. Easing up, taking up the slack in my throw-line belt, safety belt, lifeline, you might call it, which was nothing more than something to keep you from falling off backwards. And I went on up, cutting the limbs off, up to about 125 feet. And there, even at that height, the tree was about 8 inches in diameter. I had a line on my belt, and I let this line down, pulled up my handsaw. I took up the slack in my belt, cinched up the spurs as best I could, and sent them deep into the tree, and sawed this tree off at that height, at 8 inches in diameter. And it was free to swing anywhere it wanted, having no limbs on it. And when that top pitched off, it pushed me and the trunk back about 20 feet. And then whenever it pitched off into space, me and this tree went the other way about 40 feet. We pendulum back and forth there, receiving the greatest thrill you can receive of any kind. One time my strap was almost breaking. The next time I was rubbing my nose against that pine tree, hanging on for dear life, but finally I rode it through and come to the ground. That was only one of them. Every year for 18 years, I had to go out with this superintendent, the same superintendent, 18 different times. The trees were growing right up to the town, all but one side, which was the sawmill side. And those tall trees, as I told before, were standing just about as close together as they could stand. we would go out in those trees all around town on 4 quarters, 4 sides, on New Year's Eve, and we would put up dynamite. We'd string ropes on pulleys between trees, tall trees about 75 feet up and maybe 100 feet apart. And we would tie dynamite along on this rope on the ground about 4 feet apart, and we would put electric caps in them, and we'd string wires down from those electric caps to what we called a shooting gallery off somewhere behind a big pine. Then we would pull those dynamite sticks up on a rope plumb up to the top. Now that was 12 in a row. Then on the other side, they'd be the same thing. Then on another side would be the same thing. Now on the sawmill side, where there was no trees, we would stand up tall poles, and there we would tie the dynamite. Then over on one of the quarters, way up in the top of one of those tall trees, off by itself, we would tie 20 sticks of dynamite, all bound together with a cap, electric cap in it, and strung down, the wire strung down to a shooting gallery over there. Now there was a man at each one of those places standing by, and this superintendent that supervised all of this, he would have his watch watching it. When 12 o'clock came, that was the departing of the old year and the coming in of the new year, he would shoot 1 stick of dynamite. That would shake the windows on that side of your house. My wife and children were at home in bed with pillows on their heads. And then immediately following that, on the adjacent quarter, that man would fire one of his. Right on the heels of that, on the adjacent quarter, another one would fire his, and so on around. 12 times around that town, that dynamite shooting would go, shaking the windows from one side to the other. And then after it made 12 rounds of blood-curdling shooting and shocking, a silence of a few seconds, and then the top of that tree would disappear with that 20-stick one. Then it was over. You could uncover your head and say, New Year's is here. I don't know how everybody else fared, but I'm telling you, when it was over, this man was in a wreck. This particular time I want to tell you about, I had put a 20-stick charge up in a tall pine, the tallest one we could find. I had pulled it up there with the rope, plumb up with the spurs, and tied it up securely with a cap in it, just about like those Korean boys or those Vietnamese boys unloading one of those dub rockets that failed to explode. And after all of the sticks of singles were shot that night, and he pulled the trigger, you might say, on this 20 to finish his program, it was a dub. It didn't shoot. Next morning, of course, I received a little criticism for not loading it right, or not doing something right. I don't know what, but anyway, it didn't go off. Next morning, my boss, the superintendent of the plant, Mr. Emmett Lee, called me up. I can hear that voice on the phone now, just as though it was yesterday. He says, Floyd, guess you know that dynamite charge didn't go off. That big one? I says, yes, sir, I'm aware of it. He says, well, guess you'd better get up there and get it down. Yes, sir. Never questioned a word he said. So I climbed the tree. And again, we're unloading the job that didn't go off. I tied my rope securely around it and let it back to the ground. And I could feel every minute that rope breaking, slipping out of the sling, or me just losing nerve and letting it drop and it blowing that tree up with me. But it didn't. I guess you can know that it didn't, or I wouldn't be talking. So I got it down. But finally, I quit shooting the dynamite after I left there. I shot it the last year I was there. That meant about 18 times that happened to me. And it would be hard. It would be difficult. It's impossible for me to explain to you what is involved in climbing a big, long-leaf pine with the bark about an inch thick with a normal climbing spur. The spur only sticks in the bark a little bit, and you expect that piece of bark to pull off with you every minute. It's a nerve-wracking job. And what I started to say, everybody might have enjoyed the dynamite, but me. I know I didn't, because the gases from that dynamite were deadly poisonous to me. I would turn plumb white, yellow around the mouth, with a sick, deadly sick headache every time we do it. I remember the doctor told me one day when I went to him to try to get something for my head, he says, Mr. Cryer, you're the biggest fool I ever saw to keep doing that. Well, my job depended on it, and I had the 2 kids, so I had to keep doing it. And I kept doing it until we left there. This man stayed on there after I left. Now, whether there was ever any more dynamite shot, I doubt it, because there was no one to climb those trees. And gone to Beaumont, and there I worked in the shipyard. I went there just a little bit before the war broke, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I was already working at Beaumont when that happened. And we lived in Beaumont over on the more or less, not exactly south side, but we call it near the refinery on about 3 or 4 blocks from Magnolia Refinery. We lived there for a while, and the landlord wanted to sell the home we were all renting. When he moved us into another home, and we hadn't lived there very long, it was the same landlord, until he wanted to sell that home. But in the meantime, they were building what was known as Multimax. It was a housing project in Beaumont where shipyard workers could live. It was a number of apartments built into one building, and then a number of buildings built into more or less a community. So we moved out of that home and moved over there into this colony, community of apartment houses. We moved upstairs, and I can remember when I first went to Beaumont, I didn't know anything about town. I'd never lived in the city. I didn't know my way around. I didn't know much of anything. So I went to the YMCA and got me a room. But in the meantime, I was working at the shipyard, and the ships were full of galvanized smoke. What I mean by that, they were burning and welding galvanized material, and it gave off an awful odorous smoke. It would make you sick, give you something almost like pneumonia. I called it the shipyard distemper. Well, I had that. Oh, it makes you so sick, and you just cough and cough. And I was in that shape when I was living at the YMCA. I lived there about 2 weeks before my family moved to Beaumont. But I hadn't much more than gone to the YMCA until a couple of young missionaries. One of them I can remember was Elder Clement. I don't remember his first name. He came to see me there and found me up in the shower. I was taking a shower at the time they found me. And they come on in there and talked to me about Beaumont church activity where they were meeting. And they invited me out to the church. And we began to go to church there. And they were having church up in Cape P Hall, or the Knights of Pythias Hall. And we went there while we were living down near the refinery. I've thought of the name of that street now. It was Van Buren. We lived down there. But before we left there, the elders, they were in charge of things. They found a better place to meet over in the Woodman Hall on the extreme east side of Beaumont, very close to the river. And it was there they, you might say, organized a Sunday school. And they had already organized a Sunday school, but it was there they organized a branch. And they made me branch president. And I was just about as well experienced in that as I am this recording business. I didn't know anything about it, but I did the best I could. And I was branch president there for some time. And one of the missionaries that was in there at that time, along in that 5-year period that we lived in Beaumont while the war was going on, one of the missionaries come around and he found out that he was making eyes at one of my daughters. And they called him Harold Gividen. The name didn't register too much to me because I was working pretty hard, maybe 12 hours a day in that smoke with that awful cold and undesirable condition. But before I realized it, things were very serious. And found out that he had proposed to the younger daughter, Annie Laura, or better known as Bonnie, and it seemed like it was really serious. And there was another elder I remember that was out at that time. His name was Salters, and he was so enthusiastic about the condition until he could hardly contain himself. But they carried us, so I invited us down, seemed like it was City Hall one night, to a program that was put on by the missionaries. I don't remember the name of the program, but Elder Salter led the singing. And it was there that this young missionary asked me for my daughter. And after they were married, she left us. They were married in the temple. My wife went out and was with them. They were married for all the time and all eternity in the temple. And they have lived a wonderful life so far. They have a group of fine children, and I might say a fine group of children. Any way you look at it, it's a fine family. And they are here at our home at this time, and we're enjoying them very much. And were it not for them, I wouldn't be making this recording. It's at their request. And they wanted something for more or less a lasting enjoyment of the kids. I don't know what enjoyment they're going to get out of it unless it's more or less a comedy to them. But seriously, I think that they will enjoy knowing something about their grandparents, their ups and downs. Now, there could be a lot of fill-ins and comical things and sad things, our operations and our almost starvation periods, such as the Depression, while we lived at Waygate. Those things could be gone into in detail. Our neighbors, how we got along with them, our gardens, our jobs, our earnings, our spendings. All of those things could be mentioned and elaborated on. But I doubt if they would be worth mentioning at this time. Our children, both of them, finished their schooling, and they are very capable of raising their children, and they're doing a wonderful job of it, both of them, both Mary Helen. She married a boy by the name of Ferguson, and they're living in Beaumont. They have 3 wonderful children, 2 boys and 1 girl. They're here at this time. And Annie Laura and Hal, her husband, they're here with their fine children. I think they have 7 to their credit. They're all here, and the children are out in the yard enjoying themselves, playing with one another and with the cats and dogs. There's never a dull moment. They've just eaten up about everything that we could provide. And I think they're all happy and settled down maybe for the night, ready for the night. And I think I've told you just about everything that I can think of, unless I sit down and bit my thumbnails, my fingernails. Well, I think I'll turn the thing over to Sister Cryer or Mrs. Cryer or my better half and let her finish out or round out this program.